Welcome to another in our series of Kehillat Israel podcasts. This is a recording of Rabbi Amy Bernstein's weekly Friday morning Torah study.
This morning, I want to share with you a little bit. It's less about text this morning than it is about some interesting facts that I've been putting together in studying about Deuteronomy. I listened to a lecture from an Austrian Christian scholar who became interested in Jewish studies and Holocaust studies when he found out that his grandfather had been a Gestapo official. And he was so horrified and so traumatized by what this meant for his family and what it meant for him as somebody who descended from this man that he never knew him, that he wanted to know more and started asking questions and started reading and became very involved in Holocaust studies and Jewish, especially Jewish biblical texts. So I thought, well, that's an interesting. And so I was looking up Deuteronomy as a text of trauma, because I don't know if you remember, but I mentioned I was reading some book that said that our texts really come out of trauma. Not all of them, but many of them, including Deuteronomy, was brought to Judea by northern Israelites who had experienced the destruction of their sacred places and their kingdom. So when the kingdom of Israel falls to Assyria, that's a lot of scholars place the writing of Deuteronomy after that, before the fall of the southern kingdom. So really Deuteronomy is in some ways a response to a cataclysmic event that happened to the nation, but by then was two nations, but they had been together. So you can imagine, like, if California left the United States, let's just say, seceded from the Union, let's just say, it wouldn't be like we had no relationship to other Americans ever again, right? We would still have a history and a relationship, but it's just we'd be our own kingdom. So that's what happens with Israel and Judea. And in Judah, so the text of Deuteronomy is in part a response to what happens in Assyria, and then remains a response for Israelites after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the destruction of Judah and the exile of the remaining population. Remember, 10 tribes go into exile when the Assyrians conquer Israel, conquered the northern kingdom, okay? So the reason I'm saying this is because I want you to keep this in mind the entire time we're studying the book of Deuteronomy, because there's a lot of really disturbing parts of Deuteronomy. And you know me, I'm not an apologist for the text, but I am someone who always wants to understand the text in its context and understand where it's coming from and understand why this might have been included and how this comes to be part of our sacred literature. And it seems that Deuteronomy bases itself in large part on the culture of Assyria and Babylonia in response to them. And I'm going to show you in a second a map of the Assyrian Empire, which there was Assyria, and then there's the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and that is who destroys Israel, who destroys the northern kingdom of Israel. But to understand that reality, to understand the world that the Israelites are living in and responding to, you have to get a sense of what we're talking about when we say the Assyrian Empire. And I think this has a lot to do with how some of us are feeling right now, frankly. All right, can you see all the greens? All of the green is the Assyrian Empire. Take that in for a second. So here's Israel. Here's the Assyrian Empire, right? So you get an idea, like this little business over here stands no chance of impacting what this empire is going to do. But more than that, this scholar that I was listening to a lecture about Deuteronomy was saying that this empire, look how big it is. Look where it goes from, right? So it's past Greece into Turkey and Iran and Iraq and all the way down into Egypt, the whole Sinai Peninsula. Look at all of this. Jordan, all of it is Assyria. To sustain an empire that large, what we forget is what that took and what that meant. We know a little of it because we know so much about Roman history as Westerners. Think about the resources it takes to sustain the administration and the enforcement of borders in an ancient empire this large. What it takes is incredible amounts of military campaigns, royal military campaigns. This is the first empire, we believe, in the world. And it just takes a huge amount of military might to conquer all the little kingdoms around as the empire expands. And when the empire expands and it wants to take a small kingdom, it's going to use military force to do that. The city, they sue for peace. The Assyrians will offer peace. If the city does not surrender and pay heavy, heavy taxes to the central, empire, to Assyria, then siege warfare is what's used to conquer the city. And siege warfare means starving the population until they either surrender or until they're so weak they can't really fight. And siege engines are brought up a siege ramp, and the walls of the city are broken through, and the women and children are carried off, and so are men. But the men who are of fighting age, we have archaeological evidence that shows us what Assyrians and then the Babylonians did to the towns they conquered that did not surrender. And it's horrifying, like absolutely horrifying what they did. They flayed those men alive. They impaled them, all the way through from the bottom to the top. It's horrifying. And we have graphic imagery of this. Now that we have graphic imagery of that, why would we have graphic imagery of that? Who would put that on why would you have that surviving in the ancient world? Because it was propaganda. So the violence that they used in these military campaigns, both in Assyria and in Babylonia, the Babylonian Empire, which came after the Assyrian Empire, but was about this big, not quite as big, but almost this big. The violence that they used, they made sure that people understood how horrible their deaths were going to be if they resisted the empire taking control and not paying their taxes or anything else, or rebellion, right? Revolt, anything like that. So we have ancient propaganda from the Assyrian and Babylonian empires that show us graphically what was done to people who resisted the power of the empire. That is the situation that Israel's in when it is trying to resist being taken over and then fails. And Assyria takes over the northern kingdom, and then the Babylonians take over, they conquer Jerusalem and Judah. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about Babylonia or Assyria. It's the same techniques. It's the same empire's way of dealing with things. And then, of course, we know that they would cut a brit, a covenant, with the kings that they conquered, demanding exclusive loyalty to the Assyrian emperor and his crown prince son, and same with Babylonia. This is the context in which Deuteronomy is written. So if you think for a second about some of the graphic language and the imagery used in Deuteronomy, you can understand it when you know what Israel has witnessed, both before they're conquered, what's happening to neighboring places, and as they're conquered, the northern kingdom, and then after that, when the refugees from the north come to Judah. Many of them some flee to Judah, others are carried off, right, as spoils of war. It just enabled me to understand a lot more about when Deuteronomy says, if you don't obey the king, here's what's going to happen to you. It's because that's what was happening in their world, right? If you don't fill in the blank, then horrible things are going to happen to you because they witnessed it happening all around them, and then it happened to them. And this is the last holdout. And then even the folks from Judah who were conquered, they have this text and this understanding that they want to go back, right? That there's a promise that we will be able to go back to the land. And that longing and that vision and that dream stays in place for 2,000 years until the formation of the modern state of Israel, okay? So Deuteronomy was formed as a text in response to the trauma of the expansion of these violent empires over which Israel had no control, and same with Babylonia. And then, of course, it was the Romans. So Deuteronomy has remained relevant because we have this communal memory of suffering catastrophe together and getting through it together and hanging in together, in part by remembering these things and talking about these things, and in part by dreaming of a time when we're going to get it together and live according to what the Deuteronomist believes would prevent these kinds of things, which is being loyal to God and what God wants from us, which is to live lives and build governments of justice and equity and compassion, right? And Deuteronomy is filled with that. We've studied that several years in a row, the way that Deuteronomy is the Constitution, and it's about equity because there was so much inequity, even in Israel. So Deuteronomy really is the hope that it doesn't have to be this way, but in order for it not to be this way, we have to radically change our priorities and what we're about. And those of us who are thinking today about the forces that are way bigger than us, and I'm talking both about in Israel and here in the United States, it feels for some of us, and of course coming out of the fires, it feels like there's just things that are so much bigger than us and we don't have much control over anything. Deuteronomy doesn't allow us to stay in that place. Deuteronomy is saying you have choices and choose life. That's what the book ends with, right? Chapter 30. That's what we're going to end with is, so choose life that you and your children may live. You have options. Get it together. Reprioritize and figure out where your loyalty and energy belongs. And that should be in service of Torah values. So that's Deuteronomy in terms of its setting, which I found just very informative and very helpful as the context. Something else I wanted to say. Oh yeah, okay. So here we're gonna look at a little text. Okay. And the relief I was telling you about was from the destruction of a city called Lachish, southwest of Jerusalem. So you can look that up online, Lachish. But I also put a link in the source sheet that I'll send you. I put a link to the YouTube video of his lecture. Okay. We are in Deuteronomy and we're getting this oration by Moshe. So where is this happening? We remember? Where is Deuteronomy happening?
Right before they enter the promised land.
Okay. So this is happening. Huh?
On the border of the promised land.
On the border. Okay. So they've not yet crossed. They're standing on the other, they're encamped on the other side, and Moshe addresses them. And so they're at the border. So the Jordan is the border. The Jordan River is the border between where they are and where they're about to go. Moshe is going to reference back to Chorev, to Sinai. So that's a point the scholar makes also that I thought was very interesting, that Deuteronomy is a border text. It's a text that is Moshe's imagined oration to the people at the border, which is the Jordan River, between the Midbar and the Promised Land. And it is also at the border of life and death for Moshe. This is the speech that he gives at the border of his life, his career, his being a prophet, his being a leader, and dying, as we know he does, at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. So this is a text at the border. This is the text at the margin, or at the crossing point, right, between one reality and another. And this year, I'm going to choose to see it as an invitation to us to understand that we have agency, and we are also at a border. And a lot of us are feeling that way, both with what's happening in Israel. It's at a juncture of what needs to shift and change. It's got to stop what's going on. And here in this country, with the erosion of the judiciary and the balance of the different, branches of government and voting rights and so many other things that are vulnerable to, the only word that comes to mind is tyranny, but authoritarianism, and then erodes democracy. And Deuteronomy is all about this. It's all about take control of your government, take control of the situation, whatever ways you can, because if you don't, It's just too terrible to even think about what's going to happen. But it goes into great detail about how terrible it's going to be. All right, so let's look at this border text, the text at the border of Moshe's life and death, and the border of the Jordan and the Midbar experience. Ve'ata Yisrael. So Moshe begins the first great speech of Deuteronomy, Ve'ata with an ayin, and now Israel. Shema, like we get this word a lot in Deuteronomy, Shema. Shema, of course, means more than listen or hear. It means more like the Old English heed, right? So it's about hearing, but it's about obeying as well, right? Heed the warning. Ve'ata, and now Israel, Shema, hear. And that means obey all of the rules and laws that I'm going to teach you to do in order that you may live and that you may come and inherit the land that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh swore to your ancestors to give them. You shall not add anything to what I command you or take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh that I enjoin upon you. You saw with your own eyes what Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh did in the matter of Baal Peor, that Adonai your God wiped out from among you every person who followed Baal Peor. Therefore, who's left? Right? So that's the other thing, is who is Moshe talking to? Moshe is talking to the people who survived the trek through the desert because they were not of age when the golden calf incident happened, and they didn't refuse to go up and fight. They were not of age to refuse to go up and fight in the scouting incident. So that's who Moshe is talking to. The ones who were young enough to be excused from the punishment or the consequence of not making it to the promised land and dying in the Midbar. And he's speaking to those who did not participate in the incident at Baal Peor, because those were killed in a plague, right, that God brought against everybody who committed the heresy of Baal Peor. So these are the folks who remained loyal on some level and the folks who were too young to be held responsible for the actions of the generation of the Midbar. So he's talking to a new generation. Re'eh, look, see, I have taught you laws and rules that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh has commanded me, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh Elohai, my God, la'asot, to do them. Ken bekerev ha'aretz, for you to abide in the midst of the land that you are coming there to inherit. Ushmartem, and you shall shmor them, right? When we say this on Shabbat, shmor v'zachor, you observe them, va'asitem, and do them, because he chachmatchem uvinatchem. It is your wisdom and your understanding in the eyes of all the other nations who will hear these laws and will say, Rak am chacham, only an am, a people chacham, that is wise, v'navon, and understanding, hagoy hagadol hazeh, is this great nation. Meaning, when people hear the laws that this new nation is living by, which, of course, historically, when Deuteronomy is written, has already fallen, the northern kingdom. So the message to the southern kingdom is, get it together. Live by the laws that you know have been commanded by Torah, because you're not doing it. You're not doing it. You're not taking care of the poor and the widow and the orphan and the vulnerable. You're not doing it. But of course, this is retrojected onto Moshe talking to the people about to form this new nation, that when other nations around think under the Assyrian thumb, under the Babylonian thumb, when they hear, they'll say, wow, what an incredible nation, what an incredible people, that they choose to live by these kinds of laws about justice and fairness and protection of the vulnerable rather than exploitation of the vulnerable, which is what they saw all around them. And what we're seeing, if you ask me, in our own time, in our own country. For what great nation is there that has a God so close at hand as is our God, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, whenever we call? And what nation has laws and rules as perfect as all this teaching that I set before you this day? Take utmost care and watch yourselves scrupulously so that you do not forget the things that you saw with your own eyes, and so that they do not fade from your mind as long as you live, and make them known to your children and your children's children. Now remember, Moshe is speaking to people who did not witness the desert experience. right? I mean, that's who these words are directed to. The Deuteronomist is putting it in the mouth of Moses, but the Deuteronomist is not speaking to people who witness these things with their own eyes. But what have they seen? With their own eyes, they've seen what living by different values renders. They've seen the suffering and the torture and the oppression that comes when you don't live in line with the teachings of this Torah. And the Torah in that case means the book of Deuteronomy and all of the laws and priorities and ways of deciding what's right that Deuteronomy sets forth. The day you stood before God at Horeb, so here's Moshe referencing back to Horeb, and he's going to reference forward to the fall of the nation. He's going all the way back to Sinai and all the way forward to the exile. The day you stood before God at Horeb, when God said to me, gather the people that I may let them hear my words in order that they may learn to revere me as long as they live on earth and may so teach their children. So over and over, who's Deuteronomy saying this is for? You and your children and your children's children, because that's who's reading Deuteronomy, or the children's 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 children, right? You came forward and stood at the blazing mountain, right? And this goes through the Ten Commandments and Revelation at Horeb, like the tradition for the Deuteronomist is at Horeb. We're going to go down a little bit to begin chapter 5. Moshe says, Yireh was angry with me on your account and swore that I should not cross the Jordan and enter the good land that your God, Yireh is assigning you as a heritage. For I must die in this land. I shall not cross the Jordan, but you will cross and take possession of that good land. Take care then not to forget the covenant that Yireh your God concluded with you, and not to make for yourselves a sculptured image in any likeness against which your God Yireh has enjoined you. Because God is Esh Ochla. God is an all-consuming fire. God is Kana. God is entitled to our exclusive loyalty and the response when that is breached. When you have begotten children and children's children and are long established in the land, meaning you people who are reading this right now, should you act wickedly and make for yourselves a sculptured image in any likeness causing your God Yireh displeasure and vexation, I call heaven and earth this day to witness against you that you shall soon perish from the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess. You shall not long endure in it, but shall be utterly wiped out. Yireh will scatter you among the peoples, and only a scant few of you shall be left among the nations to which Yireh will drive you. So Moshe has referenced all the way back to Horeb, standing at the border, standing at this moment, and is already speaking to the destruction and the exile and the scattering of the peoples, warning Judah, get your act together, or the same is going to happen to you. So, of course, talking about idolatry, but if you search and you find Yireh your God, if only you will search b'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha, very Deuteronomic language, right? With all of your heart, with all of your being. And when you're in distress because of the things that have fallen you, and in the end return to and obey your God, because Yireh is compassionate, rachum, God will not fail you, nor let you perish. God will not forget the covenant made on oath with your ancestors. You have but to inquire about bygone ages that came before you. Hello. Ever since God created humankind on earth, from one end of heaven to the other, has anything as grand as this ever happened, or has its like ever been known? I would ask the same question about the United States of America right now. I feel like this text is speaking to me as deeply as an American as it is as a Jew. Has there ever been a project as amazing as this one? And you're screwing it up, right? So has any people heard a vision like the ones, that made America, Israel possible? And it's been demonstrated to you, in my language of liberal Judaism, I would say it's been demonstrated to you what works, right? What priorities work. In the language of Deuteronomy, it's, you've been shown that there's only God, no other God for you. And God loved your ancestors and chose their heirs, y'all, after them and led them out of Egypt and gave us, right, the promised land. Observe everything. And then Moshe sets aside the cities of refuge. And then I wanted to just cover the beginning of 5. Moshe summoned all the Israelites and said to them, Shema Yisrael, listen up, Israelite. Listen to what? Listen and obey. the laws and the mishpatim that I am speaking in your ears, hayom, today, ulamadatem otam, and you shall learn them, ushmartem la'asotam, and observe them in order to do them. God made a covenant with us at Chorev. It was not with our ancestors that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh made this covenant, but with us, the living, every one of us who is here today. The instructor that I listened to, this amazing lecture that I listened to, he was saying this, in his opinion, is one of the reasons the Jewish people have survived over millennia, is because the deep, deep wisdom of using Hayom, today, God is speaking to you today, means that it's not a covenant just that we inherited. If you look carefully at the language of Deuteronomy, it doesn't say you're bound by a covenant your ancestors made. It's beyond that. He said that's how the Jewish people have survived. They tell their story of destruction and resurrection. They continue to tell that story. They continue to hold on to some kind of comforting vision of a return to being able to live in the land according to their own texts and understandings of what's right and what's wrong. And Moshe in Deuteronomy says this covenant was not made with your ancestors. Yes, they made one at Chorev. This one was made with you. And that, he said, is the genius move of the Jewish people that has allowed us to sustain an identity as a people, even in exile. That this is the story we come back to, that it's happened before and we're living in it again. We are fortunate enough to live in a time where we have seen a return to the land, and the Deuteronomists would ask the sitting government in Israel, how are you doing? Looking at these laws and looking at these priorities and looking at the, how do you think you're doing? And that is the set of questions the Deuteronomist says is what is demanded of us, is to live and to govern by the laws put forth in Deuteronomy. Now, how you interpret those, obviously, that's where the arguments come in. But that has to be the agreement, is that that's the priority, is living by the values stated in Deuteronomy. And those are the questions we need to be asking as Jewish Americans of our government. How do we think our government's doing? Taking care of, yes, is Bibi writing out the Torah, right? Is Trump writing out the Torah, right? Like, so, right? Because that's what the king is commanded to do in Israel, is write a Sefer Torah, because that amount of labor and work with the word, the law, the things we are supposed to be governing in the light of and governed by in terms of principles, to spend that kind of time writing a Sefer Torah, that's a lot of time spent with the laws. And that's purposeful, right? The king has to write, and of course the law meant the book of Deuteronomy. The Torah meant the book of Deuteronomy, we think. But whatever, that's still, writing out the book of Deuteronomy is in the ancient world is not an easy task. They didn't have a word processor. So it's a way to, it's a image of Davka the king, not even the king, Davka, especially the king, has to know the law and has to know the priorities of the law in order to govern in a way and build a society that God will approve of and will therefore allow you to keep the land and allow you to occupy the land independently without coming under the thumb of Assyria or Babylonia. Okay? And then, of course, after the second destruction, it becomes a longing for a return. After the Roman destruction, it becomes a longing for a return. We returned once. Why not again? If we get our act together. But until then, we're going to figure out how to live these values where we are, in the communities where we are, but continue to come back to this narrative. And that, he said, is what keeps the Jewish people, even in their dispersal, over thousands of years, a people with an identity that allows peoplehood to flourish even in exile, and distant exile over a distant time, which I just found a very powerful way to think about our reading Deuteronomy, right? It's not even so much what's in it. That's good too. But the fact that we're reading it and have continued to do so in exile, we are doing exactly what our ancestors did to further our experience of people. Now, the question becomes, of course, how do we interpret what this demands of us? And how do we bring whatever power we have to bear on those who are making decisions? Because it does feel a little bit like Assyria. Like it does feel a little bit like it's all too big for us to take on. And I was having a conversation with someone who was very distressed about what's happening in Israel, in Gaza, and we were having a conversation about how is it we're expecting Israelis to impact the decisions of the government when I'm sitting in Los Angeles with ICE agents raiding car washes and taking nannies away from little kids at preschool doors. For me, that's a critical thing for us right now, is to realize we cannot give up agency and say it's bigger than us. That is what the Deuteronomist is saying is ultimately what will bring us down. What that means, I don't know. The Deuteronomist understood that school understood what they thought needed to happen. We need to be listening to the visionaries of our time and start figuring out what to do and not let it become, they're recruiting 10,000 new ICE agents. 10,000. That's an army, people. That's a private army. How do I, Amy Bernstein, impact that reality unfolding? I don't know, but I know we can't. Deuteronomy tells us we are obligated to stay in the fight, to protect those who are vulnerable and who don't have protection. All right. Sorry, I know it was a bit of a soapbox, but that's what happens when you get time to recuperate and reflect and study and go down all kinds of rabbit holes with all kinds of wonderful scholars. It really does. You take a step back and say, okay, wow, Deuteronomy is screaming right now to me on so many levels. Okay. Anything anybody wants to say about that? Okay. Let me see what else I wanted to tell you.
I was just going to say, I just having returned from Paris, being in another country, I am just so phenomenally pained every day. And this, I used to do work for the Voice of America, going to other countries, talking about how great the American dream was, and a lot, not so much our foreign policy, but our principles. And it's something, quite honestly, it would be very difficult for me to do today. And this, for me, it goes beyond politics. I feel like I'm on a boat, and the boat is sinking, and nobody is really out there to try and plug all the holes. And every day there's more stuff, and every day it feels more like a fascist country. And it's very profoundly disturbing. Not just our country, but as you say, Israel. And when I read Deuteronomy and when I look at what we're supposed to stand for, and worse, what the world now thinks of us, I don't know that I can point to Israel and say, this is, a wonderful beacon of hope in the world and it's wonderful for Jews. But when I see what's going on in Gaza, it's just profoundly, profoundly disturbing.
Well, and I just want to put a friendly amendment onto that, if I can, Bert, which is Deuteronomy is suggesting there is no difference between living our values and politics.
Yeah.
Deuteronomy is suggesting and saying your laws, you keep these laws. These are supposed to be your laws, Israelites, right? And laws that come out of these values. And if you don't build a society, meaning a political system that observes these laws, you have forfeited your right to be a civilization, and you will be destroyed and carried off. And for me, that's the profound resonance of Deuteronomy right now to everything you just said, is there is no difference between Torah and politics in Deuteronomy. It is a political treatise on what the government is supposed to be about. The leadership is supposed to be about. The king can't have too many horses. The king can't have too many wives, right? There's limits placed on the king. The king is subject to the law. And anyway, I'll stop preaching. Rachel.
Thank you. So I think, obviously everything Bert said, everything you've said, Rabbi, 100%. But I also think it seems to me that one of the messages in Deuteronomy is also that line, choose life, can also be taken maybe as a message, but know when, don't necessarily go throw yourself on top of the pike. And so here, one of the things I've been listening to a lot, one of my favorite podcasts that's kind of like markets related political, they've been talking a lot about communist China, so-called, right? And, the way that party politics work in a system like that, which I think is a very subtle way of these journalists who are supposed to be unbiased, are presenting information to us, and letting us make our own comparisons and draw our own conclusions. The way that, a leader can decide there are, definitions of what's, what policy will be are very amorphous, so that then the leader can say, oh, no, you got it wrong. And then there's a purge. And one of the things that I'm taking from it is that maybe we have to learn, just like so many people experienced in places like the Soviet Union and China, we have to learn subtlety, the art of subtlety. And we can do that through art, and we can do it through all kinds of expression, even academic expression. You can write your acknowledgments of praise at the beginning of your work, and then you can be very, very clever and subtle in the rest of it. And there are many, many ways to do this, especially because not everyone is someone who can take to the streets. But I do think that perhaps one way to think about this is to give ourselves a moment to pause and reflect, because I know we all feel this sense of urgency. But people have done this, have navigated this throughout history many, many, many times, for what it's worth.
Thank you. Dana?
Well, so I'm sure everybody's having these discussions in their kitchen, where we're upset about something, and then, like Sumner said, what can I do? Your words this morning, it's like, I'm one person. What can I do? Because we all feel so strong. So then, but I also noticed when you were describing Deuteronomy and defining the king, that the king had to know the law. I mean, and the king was defined by the laws. Ultimately, the idea of a leader is a big deal for the ordinary people, because you feel like you can't do anything. So I was thinking, is a rabbi the leader? I mean, is it up to all you guys to verbalize what we need to do next? I mean, as a Jew, because I don't even feel like as an American, so I guess that's my point and my question. What do I do now, Rabbi?
Yeah, great, thanks. I think it's our job as teachers and rabbis and leaders in the Jewish community to come back to our core texts and to come back to our core values and to teach them that way. This is what Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Moshe, our rabbi, he's the exemplar, right? He's a teacher. That's our job, is to teach. There are people who are way more talented and smarter about how to implement a lot of these things and what those policies would look like and what laws would flow from, having protections for the vulnerable. There are people who can do that. I'm not a statesman. That's not my talent. And not my strength. Our job as Jews is to come back to the foundational understandings of what justice means, what it looks like, what the wealthy imposing their will on the poor, what that means. And according to our tradition, that is sacrilege. That is turning against Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh and the path of holiness. Our struggle is to figure out how to live into the path of holiness now, like with what we're able to do. And like Rachel said, finding the ways that we can help influence things that are happening around us for the better. And then we have to argue about what that is. Right? I don't have great answers, but I know what questions we should be asking, and they're not the questions that I see us asking as America. Or let me rephrase it. I don't see those questions being asked by our sitting government. How do we protect those who don't have protection? How do we take care of the poor? So keeping those questions alive, pushing back in every way we can, I think is critical. Supporting the causes that we believe in, who are fighting for those things, I think is critical. All right, let me just show you. I was going to show you. Here we go. This is why I wanted to show you, because this was just written by Rabbi Francine Roston. Again, thinking about Deuteronomy and kind of as a post-traumatic piece of literature. So a trauma-informed reading of Parshat Devarim advice to activists on rebuilding resiliency. So this was like, okay, you're preaching now to somebody who needs to hear this. As much as Moses told them not to be afraid and that everything would be okay because God was with them, they couldn't comprehend this. They were stuck in the past, fearful of every threat, imagined or real, and unable to accurately understand the situation before them. This is the impact of trauma on our minds. The trauma of slavery had profoundly impacted the Israelites' capacity to access hope in the face of threat. Remember that Moses never lived as a slave. Where Moses saw promise, the Israelites saw danger. Their traumatic memories were active and ever present in their mind, making them not yet ready to enter into the next battle. The decades of travel through the desert became a therapeutic holding space to build up Israel's resiliency and capacity to be in a committed relationship with God. A generation later, Israel stood at Kadesh Barnea again, and we read the same command to set their course toward the promised land. Rav lachem, Sof et hahar hazeh, pnu lachem tzafona. You've been skirting this hill country long enough. Now turn tzafona, north. Indeed, Adonai, your God, has blessed you in all your undertakings. God has watched over your wanderings through this great wilderness. Adonai, your God, has been with you these past 40 years. You have lacked nothing. This time, the Israelites are able to hear God's command and Moses' reassurance. This time, they are standing in Kadesh Barnea, firmly grounded in the present's opportunities. The past provides the resources to give them strength in times of adversity and faith in God's presence and benevolence. While God's judgment of the Exodus generation and its sentence to wander in the desert until a new generation was prepared may seem harsh and unreasonable, Israel's experience of post-traumatic growth can point us in the direction of healing, resiliency, and hope. Y'all know that I am in the middle of taking this online intensive course about post-traumatic growth. It's amazing. It's just amazing. As we experience so many threats to democracy and fear for our neighbors' welfare and our children's future, are there not many times that challenge our capacity to maintain hope and resiliency? These are the times when we must stop and ground ourselves in the present, recount our blessings, witness the beauty in the world, savor the joy. We all carry historical trauma, so we must be careful to pick up resources along our way that promote well-being and resiliency. The road ahead will always hold potholes and detours. The challenge is to utilize the rest stops and our vast spiritual toolkit. Only then will we fulfill our own divinely mandated journeys and find our way to the promised land. So to answer a little bit of what Dana was saying, to respond to Rachel, right? It's, and all of you, it's this rabbi is saying that, the first thing we have to do is take care not to become hopeless and not to become despairing in a way that will prevent us from being able to respond to the ways that we can answer the call, if that makes any sense. That it's not even about the solution at first. It's about take care of yourself, take care of your community, do and be about those things that will give you energy, that will give you resiliency, so that when somebody figures it out and you hear something that makes sense, you can go, yes, that's what we need to do. And I'm going to roll up my sleeves and do my part, which we can't do if we succumb to despair. That's what happened to the generation that had to die in the wilderness, because they couldn't do it out of their own trauma. And so we have to figure out a way to take the trauma of our people, epigenetic trauma from our families, all of that, and take it, the suffering of first peoples here in this country that we built this land on, that we took from, all of it. We have to figure out a way to address all of that and what it does to us so that we can set our minds to a setting that allows us to respond to the creativity that is going to get us out of the dangerous spiral that we're in. What some of us think is a dangerous spiral. Not everybody does. I totally own that. I totally understand that. I don't mean to speak for everybody. Anything else, people? You want to say?
If I might introduce myself, I'm David Fogelson. I'm not a member of the synagogue. Bruce Kagan and Rick Siegel highly recommended I attend this Torah study, so here I am. I'm a psychiatrist, and I deal a lot with trauma. And I guess what I would say is things can feel overwhelmingly helpless and hopeless right now. Looking at the greater political context that you've already reviewed, looking at our very local context of, the horrible traumas our community has suffered. And what I would say is what this text is saying is, but we have strength and we have resilience, and what we say matters and what we do matters, and we do have agency. And every little decision we make matters. And then if you have a community that's adhering to justice and to laws and rules that protect the downtrodden and the poor and the sick, that makes a difference. And if you hold to those traditions, and so it's hard. It's very hard when you've suffered these kinds of traumas and when you feel assaulted on all fronts to feel like you have power and agency, but I believe you do.
Well, we need people like you to keep doing your work to help people like us. No, truly, because that's it. That's the key, right? To any kind of response to trauma that's going to be growthful and fruitful and helpful is that we have to figure out, okay, well, what can I do? Where do I have agency? What can I control, if you want to use that word? And that in some ways, trauma in this course that I'm taking, post-traumatic growth through the Colorado Institute, the Boulder Institute, he says that not every adverse event is a trauma, and not everyone and I'm not trying to step on your world. I'm just telling you what I'm understanding from this learning, which is very fruitful for me. And he said, not every difficult, really difficult thing even that happens to a person is traumatic. What makes it trauma is when it cuts at our core beliefs about how the world works, and when it cuts to our core narrative of our own story in our own lives. That's when it's trauma. And so, in other words, things can be really difficult for somebody, and they are resilient, and they muddle through and they get through, because resilience is different than post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is that it's been a trauma, which means it's assaulted our basic understandings of the world and our place in it. And that's trauma. And then it's about, okay, so how do we choose to respond to the reality that we've experienced trauma? And that's what our tradition is telling us, I believe, over and over, is what the Midbar generation couldn't do. They couldn't hear ways that they could have agency, and they couldn't hear ways that they could hold the trauma and change their narrative. They couldn't. And so that's the work. That's the work. And for some of it, like, I'm realizing that for some people, losing everything, their home, their material stuff, is not necessarily a trauma. Somebody might say it's just stuff, and I have enough money to replace the stuff I need. I have enough money to live well into retirement, to leave money to my grandchildren. It's not necessarily a trauma. It's a difficult, adverse event. What makes it a trauma is that it's a seismic, event psychologically to how we understand the world. And for me, that this fire was a trauma, is a trauma, because it goes right back to my childhood of financial insecurity and my belief that if I just got a good education and worked really hard and did a really good job and built a good reputation and had a decent salary and managed to keep that job, that I would have enough to retire, and I would have a home, and I would have a way to take care of my daughter and to give her a roof over her head no matter what. And this destroyed that worldview for me, that narrative of this is how the world works. Because it's not true, it turns out. My major asset burned to the ground. So, meaning, and I still owe the bank for it, and I can't sell it. So, will I come out okay in the end? I don't know. But it's a trauma because everything I trusted about what was not supposed to happen, but everything, if I do it right, is going to happen. Illness, I know. Car accidents, I know. I'm a rabbi. I've seen it for almost 30 years. I get it. But this one, living without a sense of material security when I've done everything right? No. All right. And so we're going to have to figure out how we respond to our own understanding of what is traumatic. And we will need you experts like you, Mark, and you, David. We will need you all to help us, and the experts who are writing poetry, and the experts who are creating music, and the Lisa Oltons who are creating the art you see behind her, right? All of the ways that we have to respond to holding the better parts of ourselves through the awful to get to a place where we can flourish again.
You've been listening to Rabbi Amy Bernstein's Friday Morning Torah Study from Kehillat Israel in Pacific Palisades, California. For more information, go to our website, www.ourki.org.